people are always asking me, well, what's your favorite wine? I don't really have a favorite wine. I like them all, or just about all of them. Because, it's like saying, who's the most beautiful woman that you've ever seen? Well, I've seen a lot of very beautiful women. I only married one, but I've seen a lot of attractive women.
I'm your host, Brian McCann, and this is the Road to Wine Expert podcast. My interview today is with George Taber, the author of A Judgement of Paris, which is the expanded version of his original 3-paragraph article that appeared in Time magazine covering the 1976 Paris tasting. If you're unfamiliar with that event, it went on to change the wine world as we know it. Here's what happened. In short, we put California wines up against the best French wines. And surprise to everyone, California won. I was fortunate enough to sit down with George 2 years ago on the 41st anniversary of the Paris tasting. Not quite as exciting as the 40th, but exciting to me nonetheless. One little hiccup with this interview, like my interview with James Kluwer, this is also the backup audio version. So just give yourself a few moments to sort of adjust to the audio quality, and you'll be happy you stuck around. George is a fantastic interview. He's got great opinions. He's been around the wine world for a very long time, and he has so much great insight, and I think you'll be surprised by a few of his answers. I certainly was. And if you say to yourself after a few minutes, oof, this audio is trash, no worries. The complete transcript is available on the roadtowineexpert.com. Just go to roadtowineexpert.com/George-Taber, and you can find the complete transcript of this episode there.
I did last year because it was the 40th, but
Sure.
kind of think year by year it's a little bit less. But
Yeah,
it's obviously a very important event in my life, and it still has legs, as they say.
That's very good. Did you think 41 years ago that it would really, when you were attending the tasting, that it was going to be a definitive moment in your career?
Not really. In fact, in a lot of ways, it wasn't a definitive moment in my career as a journalist, because it was just kind of another story, and it wasn't, as you know, it wasn't a long story. It was only 4 paragraphs long. So at that time, I had no. I hate to admit this, but I had no idea it would turn out to be such a historic event.
Yeah.
With time.
Yeah, it's truly amazing. I mean, I went in the reverse order. I read your book first, The Judgement of Paris, and then I went back and found the original article. And it's sort of amazing to me that you were able to even fit it in 4 paragraphs to begin with.
Well, what I wrote was much longer. The editors in Time, boiled down. Because when you were a reporter in the field and at those days in Time, you wrote the whole story, basically everything that you had, in form that could be printed, but still, longer than you could actually get in the magazine, because they didn't know, kind of how long the story before this, the story after this would be. So. At the time, I didn't know exactly how long it would be.
Sure. Excellent. That makes a lot of sense. I think your book is so great. I mean, you went into just so much detail in talking about not only the event itself, which is certainly compelling, but, in researching and covering sort of the backstories behind the different wineries and chateaus. Was that something you did after the fact, or did you sort of have?
What really happened was I was invited by Warren Winarski, who I had never met, the owner of Stag Steak Wine Cellars, to come out to an event in Napa Valley for the 20th anniversary of that group of winemakers that went to Paris, who actually took the wines into Paris. It wasn't a 20th anniversary. It happened to be the 20th anniversary of the Paris tasting, but the event in Napa was really for an anniversary for that trip. Andrei Chelichev had put together the trip, and that was the group actually took the wines into Paris because, as you remember, Steven Spurrier was very worried about the possibility of not being able to get the wines into Paris because he had some bad experience getting British wines into Paris. Believe it or not, the British do make wine. In fact, Stephen now has a winery himself. He has a business making sparkling wines in the lower part of England. They've been making wines there since Roman days. So they wanted to be sure to get the wines in. So that's why the organizers of the trip decided to take the wines for the tasting, not realizing what would happen.
Sure. That's pretty incredible. Yeah, it's amazing. British wine is becoming more and more of a thing with global warming and everything else. So I know that there's plenty of people from the Champagne region who have interest there. So it's cool to see sort of how wine has changed just in the short time I've been in it. But I imagine it's even more far-reaching for you, being 41 years. But speaking of that, does the Judgment of Paris, does that mark your intro into wine, or where did it really start? When did you become fascinated with wine?
I think it was because that was one of your questions, and I've thought about that, and I think it was probably when I went to Europe on a junior year abroad program. I was studying at Georgetown University, and they had a junior year abroad program in Switzerland, and that was really the first time. I had a few wines before that. I think maybe the very first wine I had was when I was in college as a freshman, and an Italian classmate of mine who lived in Washington invited me over for Thanksgiving, and we had wine that event, and I remember that so specifically because it was, I believe, the first time I had ever had wine. We didn't have wine growing up, but this was a typical Italian family, and they had, had wine as a natural part of having a meal. But when I went back to Europe and spent a year in Europe, even though we were in Switzerland, not a huge wine making country, although they do make some wine, that was where I really got my introduction to wine as just a staple of what you do. It's not like drinking bourbon at night to get high. It was it was part of life and part of a meal, especially a quality meal would be a glass of wine or a bottle of wine. So I think it was that junior year abroad program that really got me into wine and has kept me into wine the rest of my life, at least up to now.
That's so funny that you say it was a trip to Europe. That's exactly what did it for me. I was in college as well. I was between my senior and super senior year, and I had switched majors about halfway through, just because I thought I was going to be in business like my father, and then I realized I couldn't work in an office for my whole life, so I switched to Spanish, and then I studied abroad in Spain and stayed with a family, and that was the transformative experience for me. But just like you said, wine on the table, it was part of life. It was, a fuel for conversation and good times, and it was just something that was always present. And it's something when it's not around, I always feel a little weird or a little on edge. Especially if
that is good a meal if it doesn't have a bottle of wine with it.
I couldn't agree more. So with all these years and all these expertise, that you've developed, you've written a lot of books. What do you see as the struggle for people, trying to become wine experts, or, I use that term sort of loosely. I think you saw it was in quotes. But, for people wanting to learn more, what's the biggest hurdle, or what do you see the difficulties for
I
them?
think the biggest hurdle would be to be intimidated. I think the wine snobs are called wine snobs because they're snobbish, and they like to make it more complex and more haughty than it really is. It's just, again, it's just a product that you have with a meal. So don't be intimidated by wine. Enjoy it. I think from my experience, some people are better tasters than others, and I never figure out why some people seem to be able to spot things in wine that other people don't. But I think from my experience, that does happen. But enjoy it, and whatever, if it gives you pleasure, and I think it probably will. Have a glass of wine. Drink, not to get drunk, but to enhance life and enhance the food.
I think that's excellent advice. You alluded to the wine snobs. You also wrote a book, A Toast to Bargain Wines. Was that your inspiration to sort of break down the barriers? That was exactly it. I thought there's just there's too many people out there think that that you can only have a $50 bottle of wine, and there are lots of very good wines out there. In as I recall, the point I had for the book was $10 or under. I think you may have to go a little higher than that now. It's been about, I can't remember how many years it's been several years now since that book was out, and wine prices have gone up a little bit since then. So, but I think in that $10 to $15 range, there's just a lot of very good wines from all around the world. And people are always asking me, well, what's your favorite wine? I don't really have a favorite wine. I like them all, or just about all of them. Because, it's like saying, who's the most beautiful woman that you've ever seen? Well, I've seen a lot of very beautiful women. I only married one, but I've seen a lot of attractive women. And I think that's the approach that one should have to take. It's just, it's part of life. It's enjoy it, but don't drink to excess, because obviously if you do, you're not getting the benefit of it, because you're drunk. You're not enjoying the wine anymore. Well, and if you drink to excess, then suddenly every woman in the room becomes beautiful, and that's a problem too.
Yeah.
But at least you'll get to see a lot of beautiful women that way. I absolutely love that metaphor. That's so wonderful. I'm gonna.
But
to
go back to the thing of that, kind of how I came to write the book. It was at that part of it was called the Chalachev trip of winemakers that went to Paris, led by Andrei Chalachev, the great Russian-born, French-educated, but has a career in California, winemaker. Took the tour, and they had the 20th anniversary. And Warren, who I'd never met, invited me to come out and stay with him for a couple of days and attend this reunion of the Chalachev group. And it was, as I was there at the reunion talking to all these wineries, winemakers, and it was virtually all of the leading winemakers of California were there, and of Napa were there that day. It really struck me, because they all said basically the same thing, which is that was the turning point for us. It was that day that we got recognized as making good wines, was that event in Paris. And I thought, well, gee, somebody's got to write the story of that, the book. And so it was at that point that I started thinking, well, I was in the best position, I thought, to write the book, since I had been there. And I had my notes and all of the things that went into it. So why didn't I do it rather than have somebody else interview me? Let me interview other people, and so that's how the book came to be.
And you were there. You were the only one there, the only journalist to cover the event. Because
I was too dumb to realize that all the other journalists were smart enough to know that the French wines were obviously going to win. So it was going to be what in journalistic terms they call it a non-event. It wasn't nobody's going to write a story about. Nobody's going to publish a story about French wines and California wines being tasted in Paris and French wines winning. That would be a non-event. It was only because of the when I got and I turned it down actually the first time, but I got a second. Stephen Spurrier at the last minute, or not the last minute, a few days before the event, was very worried because he used to hold these events and they were really publicity events. They just made to make himself better known in Paris, maybe even outside of Paris, events. And he would do things. And he was a young guy at that point. I think he was about 34 years old, which of course now is a very young man. But he would have these events, and once, for example, he did a tasting of all the first growths. At that point, there were only 4. There are now 5, and putting them comparatively so that people could compare, the very best of the best. And the French never did that, because if you did a tasting like that, you're going to have 4 losers and 1 winner, and these were the very best, and so don't have a competition between them. But Stephen did that, and he did special events for the Beaujolais Nouveau, and that came out, and so he had all of these things, and this was just going to be another one of his events. But then when he got there, nobody was coming, so he called me because he remembered that I had taken a course at his school, his wine school. I took his basic course, an introduction to French wine, it was called. And since he knew me, he said, well, he told me this later, he said, I figured, well, maybe, since Tabor had, taken our course, and, I'll give him a second chance. And fortunately, he did give me a second chance, and that's how I also got there.
It's so wild. I mean, it's so funny, too, because so much of wine, just wine itself as the bottle, is story. And like you said, sharing it over a meal, there's the story there. And then you have this, story of wine and all these little sub-stories. So it's so fascinating to hear these details that, it's, all these things sort of fell into place to make it the event that it was. That's really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
So
I was lucky, as I say. I was lucky.
Yeah. Well, you got to put yourself in the position to be lucky. What led you to Paris in the first place?
Well, I had been a staff reporter for Time magazine at that point for about 4 or 5 years. And, Paris was just an assignment. I was sent to Paris because I spoke French. And, not every reporter working for Time magazine in those days spoke French, so it was a natural. I was the junior reporter in the office. Time was it's amazing. I still can't imagine this, and although I know it's true that Time had had been lots and lots of reporters, but not that many who spoke English. No, who spoke French. So that's why I was sent to Paris. And then the fact that I was the only reporter there that day. But I was the number 2 person in the bureau.
Very cool. So looking back, on your career in wine, if you were to start over again, Is there anything you do differently?
I don't think so. I think the best thing for one's career in wine is drink what you can. I urge people to, don't get in a rut. Don't say, okay, I'm only going to have Haut-Brion wine every day like this. Figure out what you can afford to buy, but then you get a variety of things because, and today, is one of the wonderful things of wine. As I said, I'm pretty sure I said it in the book. This is the golden age of wine, because the Paris tasting had a great impact on French wines or on California wines, without a doubt. But it also had a great impact on winemakers around the world because the same reason, it broke the myth that only in France could you make great wines. And so winemakers in Italy and Spain and Australia and South Africa, who maybe, felt, hey, we're third-class producers and we'll always be third-class producers. It inspired them to say, hey, look at it. If the Californians can do it, maybe we can do it here in South Africa. South Africa is a long ways from France, but why not? And so I only discovered this, and that's where I was so lucky that I wrote the book 20 years after the event, because you would only see these kind of this kind of impact, 20 years after, and this wasn't my idea. I can't remember who it was that gave me this concept of it. But in Napa, several people told me, I said after the Paris tasting, they were just flooded with people, largely French at the beginning, wanting to see what was going on in California. So the big French wine producers started sending their young children, their young adults, the youngsters in the family that were going to be working in the wine business, to California to see what was going on there, because they said, hey, look at us, something's going on here. Let's see what they're doing. And winemakers around the world started doing the same things. And so they all lifted up the game, as it were, because of the Paris tasting. I'm not trying to brag because it was anything that I had to do. It was just, a fact of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And the 20-year buffer between, the original article and the book certainly gave you perspective, which is something you wouldn't have had had you tried to, create that story at the time. One of the things I wanted to know is, you've made a career out of writing, and you've written several wine books. If someone wanted to do what you do, and write about wine, what path would you recommend they take?
I think today, if you really wanted to specialize in wine, the wine business is interesting, and is unlike an awful lot of other businesses. I'm almost tempted to say it's unique, but there must be other fields that are similar to it. But they have periods in the year when they need a lot of help. The harvest period. You don't need 1,000 workers in a winery for most of the year, but when the harvest comes in, you've got to have a lot more extra help. So they look for that extra help, and I think if you really wanted to make a career out of wine, no matter where in the career you wanted to do, you want to be a sommelier or you want to be a wine writer or whatever it is. And I did not have this kind of experience myself. I would recommend that somebody else might, if they have the time and the money and interest to do it, would be to harvest wine, work for a period in the vineyard, seeing the process as it develops. I think I can't be certain because I haven't done it, but I think you would learn an awful lot of that. It would be a lifetime of education that you would get from just one harvest. Harvest lasts, a month or two, and just how they harvest, when they harvest, how they go about going from grapes to wine. I think that would be a very, and you'd also, I think you'd get some tasting expertise because you'd be around people who are tasting it at that point. You have the time and money and interest, go work in a winery for a harvest.
Good. Noted. I will do that. I will put it on my list.
Okay. It wouldn't be hard because they need help, It's not like you're going to be, thousands and thousands of people knocking on their door to get in. I mean, obviously the higher the more famous the winery, the more difficult it would be to get in, but, you give it a try if you're really interested.
So would you say that, going and attending a harvest or really, and helping out in a harvest, is that maybe the best kept secret for people wanting to learn more about wine?
I think they are. I think a lot of people don't realize that they don't. It's not like they'd explain it like I have explained it to you. Nobody has ever said, "Oh, gee," more than never thought of that. But I think that is the fact that they just have never thought that about the cycle of the wine year. And there is a need for people, and so it's not something that you have to take 4 years in college in order to then take a summer work in the vineyards.
Yeah, not a bad way to spend a couple weeks, in a vineyard in a beautiful area of this country or some other country. It could be a great work vacation. So to speak, because it's certainly hard work, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Is there anything, you mentioned...
That's why they call them cellar rats. That's a phrase that's often used for those people that come in for the harvest. They call them cellar rats.
You mentioned, you fell in love with wine and sort of had this appreciation when you studied abroad, and then you took... one of the classes at Steve Spurrier's wine school. Is there something you wish someone told you when you were starting out in wine? Was there an aha moment along the way that you're like, oh, why didn't someone mention this to me sooner? Is there any one of those things that sticks out to you?
Let me think, because nothing jumps out at me for sure. No, I think it was a slow realization. I mean, I can remember a lot of aha moments, or one of the aha moments, for example, that I remember very well was when I went on that junior year abroad program. Before we went to the university where we were going to be studying, the university, Georgetown, the requirements, you had to go for either a 2-week or a full, maybe it was a full month program in Tours, France, to get your French up to quality. And so we were taking courses at the university there, but also living with a family. And the very first night I arrived in Tours after having spent a week in Paris, we were about to sit down to have dinner, and the wife of the guy whose house I was staying at, and I was staying alone with this family. It was 6 or 7 of us. And that was good because you had to speak, in my stumbling French in those days, you had to speak to the people you were living with to have breakfast and dinner, if nothing else. But before the first night when we were there, the wife of the house, in order to kind of as a celebration, had a special wine that she brought out. We talked a little bit as far as I could stumble through about she was welcoming us, and there was they had about a 6-year-old son, and after she poured a glass of wine for all of us, her family and myself, she poured into a regular drinking glass a little bit, maybe a quarter of a glass of wine, and then she poured some water into the wine. And I thought, hey, gee, that's kind of a neat thing to do. It was for the 6-year-old boy. That's the amount of wine that's how wine was given to him, and I always remember that event because it was so unlike anything that I'd ever seen in American life. I was a very small boy having a glass of wine, even if it was watered down. So and there were a lot of aha moments like that after.
Wonderful.
And that's all part of just the education of wine. To this day, now I drink. I have a glass of wine every night for dinner.
Oh, excellent. What have you been drinking lately? Anything striking your fancy? I know you said you like to rotate, but what was maybe the last great glass or bottle you had? Well,
I drink. I don't drink just this wine, but I drink a certain amount, maybe a quarter of the wine that I drink are box wines, because again, I like to try everything. And those are very good values. That allows you to drink wine every night without breaking your budget. And people like to look their nose down at box wines because they figure that anything that's that inexpensive can't be very good. And I don't think that's the case at all. It's different. A glass of bottled wine is a glass of a first growth wine is obviously very different from a glass of box wine, but it's not to say one is bad. They're just different.
So that's totally true. I know I say sometimes that in the store, I'll say sometimes wine just needs to be wine. That's it. It doesn't have to be a transformative experience. It just needs to accompany the meal. Sometimes something else is the star.
Yeah, that is so true. I think too many people get intimidated by all the whatever you call it, all that goes around wine. The wine snobs tend to make it or try to make it complex and difficult for people to enjoy. It's not. It's just an experience, and there's some experiences that are better than others, but there are not many that are very bad. I can't think of. I've had a bad wine. Not to say I can't remember ever having a bad wine, but the number of bad bottles I've had is it's no more than 12 or 15.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. George, thank you so much again for your time. Thanks for writing about wine, sharing your passion with all of us. I know The Judgment of Paris is one of those books that I highly recommend to people who are getting into wine and people who really like story, because I think you just did a masterful job of weaving in story and wine facts. It's a really beautiful book. Yeah,
the book has had legs. It still sells very well. I haven't bothered to go into to do an updating it because it's still selling so well. In fact, why you got something that's continuing to interest people. So why blow that? So,
if it ain't broke.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, George. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it again.
Okay, great. Thanks. Great to talk to you. Okay.
It was great talking to you, George. Thank you. Have a great day.
Sure. Bye. Bye.
Thank you for sticking around and listening to this episode with George Tabor. If you felt you missed something, just a friendly reminder that transcript is available at roadtowineexpert.com. If you'd rather read than listen to this backup audio version. Furthermore, if you're into books like The Judgment of Paris, written by today's guest, George Tabor, make sure you share this episode with a friend who you think will love it, because we are on a quest for 1,000 downloads of The Road to Wine Expert. When we get there, I'm going to give away $1,000 worth of wine books, like George's Judgment of Paris, Elizabeth Schneider's new book, Hilary Zio's book, and a bunch of other guests like Bianca Bosker, and some resources of people who are not on this podcast, but were really influential in my learning about wine. So get us to 1,000, and as soon as we cross that threshold, I will share complete contest details on social media and the website. If you want to hear more about the music featured in this podcast, go to roadtowineexpert.com/music. You can learn about the artists who share their music through the Creative Commons license and make my podcast and other podcasts sound really awesome. If you want to get in touch, you can connect on Instagram. We're at Road to Wine Expert, or you can reach out via email. I'm Brian, Brian, at roadtowineexpert.com. This has been another episode of the Road to Wine Expert podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.